On a quiet corner of a bustling city, a man often seen but rarely noticed sat beneath a tattered tent. To the world, he was just a homeless beggar, a figure blurred in the background of daily life. His name was Darnell. One cold evening, while rummaging through a trash bin for scraps, he spotted something that stopped him in his tracks. A frail, shivering dog curled up against the harsh concrete. Its ribs pressed against its skin, its eyes sunken with hunger. Darnell didn't have much, barely enough to feed himself most days, but his heart was bigger than his circumstances. Gently, he knelt down, offering the starving pup half of his only meal for the day. The dog hesitated, then devoured the offering with desperation. From that moment on, the two became inseparable, surviving each day together, bound by a shared struggle. Weeks passed, and life trudged on. Darnell the dog, now healthier and wagging its tail with gratitude, found comfort in each other's company. But one evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, the faint hum of engines broke the stillness. Two sleek black Mercedes pulled up silently near his makeshift home. Men in suits stepped out, their polished shoes stark against the gritty pavement. Darnell watched, unsure whether to feel fear or curiosity. The strangers weren't like the passersby who usually ignored him. They were here for something or someone. Little did Darnell know, the simple act of kindness he showed weeks ago was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The men in suits stood silently for a moment, their sharp eyes scanning Darnell's makeshift home, and the scruffy dog curled up protectively at his feet. One of them, a tall man with an air of authority, stepped forward. "You're Darnell, right?" he asked, his tone calm but purposeful. Darnell's throat tightened. It wasn't often someone called him by his name. Most people didn't even bother to look at him. He gave a small nod, unsure what to say. The dog, sensing his unease, let out a low growl, but Darnell gently placed a hand on its head to calm it. "We've been looking for you," the man continued, his words hanging heavily in the cold evening air. Looking for him? The idea sounded absurd. Darnell had no family, no ties, nothing of value anyone would care about. He lived invisible, surviving day to day on scraps and spare change. "What do you want?" he asked cautiously, his voice rough from years of weathering the streets. Instead of answering, the man pulled out a sleek envelope and handed it to him. Darnell hesitated, his calloused fingers brushing against the smooth paper before taking it. Inside was a photograph, a familiar one. It was the dog, his dog. But in the picture, it looked different, healthier, standing beside a young girl with an unmistakable sparkle in her eyes. Darnell's heart raced as a flood of questions filled his mind. Who were these men? Why did they have this photo? And what could they possibly want with him and his four-legged companion? Darnell stared at the photograph, his hands trembling slightly. The little girl in the picture looked happy, her arm draped protectively around the dog. The image was a world away from the cold streets he knew. Confusion churned inside him, and the silence between him and the men felt heavier by the second. "Where did you get this?" he finally managed to ask, his voice uneven. The tall man exchanged a glance with one of his companions before answering. "It's a long story, but we need you to come with us. There's someone who wants to meet you." Darnell hesitated, glancing down at his dog. The thought of leaving the only place he called home, even for a moment, filled him with unease. "I don't trust strangers," he said firmly. "We understand," the man said, his tone softening. "But this isn't just about you. It's about him too." He gestured to the dog, who now sat alert, as if sensing the weight of the situation. The mention of the dog stirred something deep within Darnell. For weeks, this scrappy companion had been his only source of joy and comfort. If there was more to this story, if it somehow connected to the pup's past, he couldn't ignore it. Reluctantly, Darnell stood, pulling his worn jacket tighter around him. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. "But he comes with me." The men nodded, and moments later, Darnell found himself stepping into the pristine interior of the Mercedes. As the car pulled away, he couldn't help but wonder. Was he heading toward answers, or something far more dangerous? The ride through the city was quiet, save for the faint hum of the engine. Darnell sat stiffly, his dog nestled close to him on the seat. The luxury of the car felt foreign against his calloused hands, and the uncertainty of where they were going gnawed at him. As the car weaved through streets he barely recognized, Darnell couldn't shake the image of the girl in the photograph. Who was she? Why did she have a picture with his dog? His mind raced, filled with questions no one seemed eager to answer. After what felt like an eternity, the car slowed, turning into a long, gated driveway. The house ahead was massive, its lights glowing warmly against the evening sky. Darnell's breath caught as he took it in, a world so far removed from the one he knew. The car came to a stop, and the men stepped out. Darnell hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. A part of him wanted to run, to retreat back to the tent where life, though hard, was familiar. But the thought of the dog's picture and the girl's smile pushed him forward. As they approached the grand entrance, the door swung open, revealing a woman in her early 40s. Her eyes immediately locked on the dog, and she let out a soft gasp. "Buddy," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. The dog froze, its ears perking up at the sound of her voice. Before Darnell could process what was happening, the woman turned her gaze to him. Her expression was a mix of gratitude and urgency. "We've been searching for you both," she said, her words thick with meaning. "There's something you need to know." The woman's words hung in the air, and Darnell's chest tightened. He wasn't sure if it was the warmth in her eyes or the way the dog reacted, its tail wagging cautiously, as if it remembered something Darnell didn't know. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever she was about to say. "You saved more than just a stray," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Buddy, your dog, he's not just any dog. He belonged to my daughter, Maya." She paused, pulling a photo from her pocket. It was the same image Darnell had seen, but this one had a date written on the back, 6 months ago. Darnell frowned. "I don't understand. If he was yours, how did he end up on the streets?" The woman's face clouded with emotion. "It was the night of the accident," she said softly. "We were driving back from a trip when the car skidded off the road. Maya," her voice cracked. "She didn't make it. Buddy was in the car too. When the rescue team arrived, he was gone. We thought we'd lost him forever, until you showed up." Darnell's heart ached as he glanced down at Buddy. He had always known the dog carried a past, but he hadn't imagined it was tied to such tragedy. Before he could respond, the tall man from earlier cleared his throat. "There's more," he said grimly. "The accident wasn't an accident, and whoever caused it knows Buddy survived. They've been looking for him, and now they know he's with you." Darnell felt a chill run down his spine as the weight of their words sank in. This wasn't just about a dog anymore. It was about uncovering the truth and staying alive in the process. Darnell's mind raced as the pieces began falling into place. Buddy wasn't just a lost dog. He was a witness, perhaps the only one, to a tragedy far deeper than anyone had let on. The thought of someone wanting to harm a dog to cover up their crimes filled him with a mix of anger and fear. He tightened his grip on Buddy's leash. "What do they want with him?" he asked, his voice low. The woman hesitated, then motioned for him to follow her into the house. In the living room, she opened a drawer and pulled out a USB drive. Maya loved photography, she said. She had a camera rolling the night of the accident. We found this in the wreckage, but never looked at it until recently. What's on here could expose everything. Before Darnell could respond, a loud crash echoed from outside. The men in suits moved quickly, one pulling the curtains aside to reveal two shadowy figures approaching the house. "They're here," the tall man said grimly. Darnell's pulse quickened as the tension in the room spiked. The woman handed him the USB. "Take it. Run. They won't stop until this is exposed." Weeks later, the footage from the USB made headlines, unraveling a corporate cover-up linked to the crash. Justice was served, but what stayed with Darnell most was the twist he never saw coming. Buddy hadn't just saved his life. He had given Darnell a purpose, one that turned his life into a story of courage, redemption, and an unbreakable bond. The weeks after the footage went public felt surreal for Darnell. News outlets buzzed with the story of the corporate scandal, the tragic crash, and the unlikely hero who helped bring the truth to light. But for Darnell, it wasn't about the attention. It was about honoring the memory of a little girl he'd never met and the bond he had formed with Buddy, who had led him to this moment. The woman, Maya's mother, reached out to him shortly after. She invited Darnell to her home, not out of pity, but out of gratitude. "You gave me back a piece of her," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'll never be able to thank you enough." Darnell, hesitant at first, accepted her offer to stay in the guest house. It wasn't charity, she insisted. It was family. Over time, he began to rebuild his life, finding work, and even starting a small initiative to help other strays like Buddy. Buddy remained by his side, a constant reminder of how a simple act of kindness could ripple into something far greater. The two became inseparable, their bond stronger than ever. In the quiet moments, Darnell often thought about how different his life might have been if he had walked past Buddy that cold night. He realized that sometimes the smallest choices lead to the biggest changes. As he sat on the porch one evening, watching Buddy play in the yard, Darnell smiled. His journey had been unexpected, filled with twists and challenges, but it had led him to a place of peace and purpose. For the first time in years, he felt truly at home.